So you've been staffed on an internal project, the dream for all consultants, on a knowledge development project with the head of the firm's business technology practice. And the key question or the key thing you've been asked to investigate is the proliferation of ransomware attacks and the impact that they're having on the business community in the US. The term ransomware refers to a family of malware programs which lock IT systems, um, for example, by disabling the keyboard or preventing access to certain files, and essentially holding them, quote unquote, hostage pending a ransom payment, which is usually delivered in Bitcoin or something of that nature in cryptocurrencies. Although this has existed for a very, very long time, with the first ransomware happening in 1989 through floppy disk, this has actually, the technologies being used have become very, very advanced. And of late, the incidence rate has skyrocketed quite a bit. And it's estimated that about 700,000 corporate users are affected by ransomware every year. So if your research unearths some interesting findings, the head of the group would actually like to submit a paper to one of the firm's widely circulated publications, of which you would be a co-author. So the key question that we're actually trying to answer today is what companies should do in the case of these ransomware attacks and crises. In primary, since they have very little time to respond as they're being held ransom and they need to often unlock their files, the question that they need to answer is, should they pay the ransom or should they not?
All right, awesome. Thanks for that. Thanks for that introduction. And yeah, I'm pretty familiar with the term ransomware and its impacts because yeah, we've done a bunch of executive simulation exercises in our previous work. So quite familiar with all the cybersecurity terms here. So excited to be part of this internal playbook that we're trying to build. So my first clarifying question here is, are we trying to build this playbook in a more generic industry sense, or is there any industry that we're trying to target here?
From an industry point of view, I think let's say it's agnostic, as ransomware attackers are like pretty much going after everyone.
All right, cool. And my next question in terms of clarification would be, what sort of size are we looking at? Because the approach could be different between different sized companies based on their complexity. So do we have any information on the sort of number of people that are in the company or any sort of turnover information?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. As we've kind of learned that the mid-sized companies tend to be more susceptible to these attacks due to like, not having the right infrastructure in place or sufficient infrastructure in place. So maybe you can assume, let's say 500 million in revenue kind of companies.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good. Awesome. So if okay with you, I'd just like to take a few moments to structure my thoughts.
Yeah, sounds good.
Thanks. All right. I think I have a structure the way I'm gonna be thinking about this. So I'll try to understand what might be the costs of not paying, and then we'll think about the costs of actually going ahead and paying. And then finally, I'd like to do a risk analysis comparison between the two scenarios. And I'll just dive in deeper into each of these. In terms of not paying, I'd like to understand, are there going to be any device costs? Do we have to replace those devices because essentially they're, bugged? And the next piece would be overall in our infrastructure, do we have to perform any reparations? Do we have to perform any testing beyond this? Do we have to secure ourselves a bit more? And then most importantly, I would think that the revenue impact might be pretty significant because ransomware would essentially block your business. And so we might lose a few days of revenue because of that. And so I'd like to think of the revenue as well. So that would be in terms of if we don't go ahead and pay. If we go ahead and pay, it might be a bit more straightforward because that's essentially the cost of the ransom that we are paying. There might be any additional costs that might be incurred because if we have to bring in any additional third parties, most businesses may not be dealing with cryptocurrency, so they really have to understand how do they procure the cryptocurrency, etc. So those costs might be involved in paying. In terms of the final risk analysis to compare the two, I'd like to see what might be the better view? Obviously, from a monetary perspective, how much money are we losing? But then there's also some concerns around the reputation of the company, because if we are dealing, let's say, in a highly secure business, then our clients may not be really happy that someone broke in. So just news of this going outside. So probably having considerations on that external front. Any sort of recovery opportunities, because even though data might be lost and money might be lost, there are opportunities to recover these, and especially cryptocurrency, because it's decentralized. So it becomes easy to track where the money is going, not to whom. So that might be an option. And then also considering what might be the future in case of, let's say, there is a ransomware attack here in this company. Could there be a potential of future ransomware attacks? So this is the way I'm thinking about it. If it makes sense to you, I'd like to jump into trying to understand what might be the costs of not paying. To me, this might be like a market sizing exercise and trying to understand uh, what might be the costs associated with the initial areas that I described. Does that sound good?
Oops, I was on mute. Classic interview problems nowadays.
No worries.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds great. You've probably covered most of the things that I had in mind. I think, yeah, you're kind of right on the market sizing piece for the to not pay. Maybe you could maybe give me a sample of how you're thinking about it, and then we can maybe go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking of like a few major areas, like essentially reparations in terms of trying to figure out what the infrastructure might look like going forward. The next one I'm thinking, of course, is the kind of devices that would be impacted. And sometimes I know from experience that if a device is impacted, you don't necessarily want to use it, or maybe you want to wipe it out completely. So that there might be a cost associated to those devices. So maybe we can understand the number of devices out there, and then the revenue loss. So I think I'm in a good place to try to understand what the revenue loss might be based on how long it takes. If that sounds good, my first question would be, do we have any information on what sort of cost might be associated with reparations in terms of infrastructure? So is there any ideas around that?
Yeah, so maybe could you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Right. So I'm imagining a mid-sized firm not having a very high and a very strong cybersecurity element, and not very skilled at just understanding what their existing infrastructure is and breaking it down and trying to see where it is susceptible to attacks. So in some sense, maybe there is a need to hire either an external firm or hiring internal expertise to try to understand the infrastructure so that nothing goes wrong in future. So that sort of a cost is what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, absolutely. So they on average, firms tend to hire an external IT security consultant to come in and stress test and further secure the system. And the cost of these typically tend to be about 10,000 per week.
Okay. So we're thinking, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, we're thinking 10K per week if we were to involve an external party.
Usually it takes between 2 to 6 weeks for such an engagement.
Okay, 2 to 6 weeks of the engagement makes total sense. All right. Next up, what would be, I'm trying to understand what might be the number of devices that might be impacted. So we said $500 million in revenue. Is there any number we have in terms of employees that are working so that I can size the number of devices?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair sort of way to go about thinking about the number of devices. But I think like we do have some data on that. So we know that roughly, again, on average, about 200 devices get affected in a single attack.
All right. Okay. So 200 devices. That sounds like a very reasonable number for such a company. Cool. And then I'm trying to understand what might be the revenue disruptions because of certain of this ransomware attacks. So I'm trying to see, what do we have any sort of average time frame of how long we have to respond so that we can understand how long it'll last in terms of revenue disruptions. So I'm thinking number of hours or days that it might that it might take us to respond, which will essentially be, no revenue in that time.
Yeah, I think that's again a fair assessment. What would you think if you had to, make some kind of guess? How long do you think they would be disrupted for?
I think for an average mid-sized company, it might go well up to like 3 to 5 days. Like a whole week of business disruption is likely, if for someone who doesn't have the expertise.
Yeah, so I think that you're not very far from the answer. It's about approximately we can average it down to 2 days.
Okay.
And even beyond that, like I think just adding to that approximately 5% of these companies tend to have this chance of losing the revenue.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Not any more than 5%. That's a small number. Folks must have the playbook ready already, but all good. All right. So in terms of this sizing, the next step I would like to take is, since we started off with the reparation in terms of the specialist engagement, you said $10,000 per week, 2 to 6 weeks. Is it okay if we take like a midpoint of 4 weeks for this calculation?
Yeah, I think that
All
makes
right.
sense.
Cool. So then we're talking 40K of reparation costs. Next up, we're talking about 200 devices. So 200 devices, I'm trying to see what might be the cost of a device. And generally speaking, like, the regular laptop that we have in our company is about $1,200 on retail. So if we scale that up, not such a sophisticated laptop, is it okay if we say like between $10 and $1,200, sorry, $1,000 and $1,200 per device as a cost?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I'd let you make that calculation as easy for yourself as possible. So
Okay, sounds
pick
like it's going to be $1,000 per device then.
yes, indeed. I think that will be helpful.
Yeah. So awesome. So then we're dealing with 200 devices, 1,000 per device. So that's $200,000 of all device reparation, all device replacement essentially, or like working on them and cleaning them up. And then lastly, but pretty significant, is going to be the revenue. So we're thinking of $500 million of revenue per year. And there is a 5% chance of losing that $500 million revenue. So that's a $25 million figure.
Okay.
Next up, $25 million chance over like 365 days. Is it okay if I go with the 350 days number just for like the days in a year calculation?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Awesome. So we're thinking every day at risk is going to be $25 million divided by 350 days. That's going to be about $70K, $70,000. And then twice of that is going to be $140,000. All right. And then so our total for not paying is going to be 200K for all the devices plus 40K for the external party, and then 140K of lost revenue. That gives us a total of 380K, $380,000, which are the costs of not paying. So at this point, if we have exhausted all our options, all our costs associated with not paying, I'd like to pivot over to understand a little bit more about the costs of paying. Is that okay?
Yeah, that makes complete sense.
All right. So next up, I'm trying to see what might be the costs of paying. So for that, it essentially comes down to what are the sort of ransomware the ransomware demands that we see. Do we have any information on what our company expects there to be as like a typical demand sort of a thing, just for the sake of sizing this?
Yeah, so I think that's a fair request. We do have some data on the types of demands that come through. Let me
Okay.
really quickly share my screen with you.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen. All right. This is the okay. Awesome. So we are looking at the demand that is taking place based on surveys. Okay. What I'm seeing here is 35% of impacted companies are being asked about $500 or less, 30% 501 to 1000. Is that the right way of reading this chart?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, cool. So, okay, so this is the information. I think to understand what a typical company would have to pay out, I think we need to it looks like essentially a weighted average calculation. So if we were to take the percentages and multiply them with the demand in a sort of weighted average fashion, I think that might work out. Does that sound like a good idea to you?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, great. So the next up, to understand what might be the number. So in each of these buckets, there's 500 or less, 501 to 1000, 1000 to 5000. Is it okay if we kind of settle on the midpoint or like the median of each of these ranges and then multiply that with the percentages?
Yes, that's a fair assumption to make.
Okay, awesome. So with that, I think I'm gonna be able to break this down into obviously the four weighted average categories. So I'm gonna start off with the 500 or less. Our midpoint is gonna be 250. The next one between 500 and 1000 midpoint is gonna be 750. The next one 1000 to 5000. So that's a range of 4000. So midpoint is gonna be 3000. Yep, 3000. And 5,001 to 10,000 midpoint is going to be 7,500. So for the first range, 35% probability times $250 is $8,750. Next range, $750 times 30% probability is $225. $3,000 midpoint times 25% probability is $750. And $7,500 midpoint times 10% probability is going to be $750. All right. And if we add these four up, we are looking at just one sec. I'll quickly make the calculation. All right. We're looking at 1,812.5. So $1,812.5. Is it okay if we were to assume this number to be a bit closer to $1,800 as a typical?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay,
But
great.
yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, great. So would you mind just pulling up the chart? I just want to make sure this is the demand is per device, or is it like for the entire company?
Yes, that's a good point. Let me just quickly put it up again.
It should be per device, but let's see. Okay, yeah, it says here it's ransom demands per device. All right. So then we're looking at $1,800 per device. And so we discussed earlier that we are looking at about 200 devices. So that means 1,800 times 200, that is $360,000 being the total payout for a company of this size. Now, I'm comparing the $360,000 was the $380,000 that we had earlier, just because that's the way we want to think about comparing these, and it seems pretty close. So, do you think it might be a good idea at this point to start considering any of the other risks that I initially mentioned in terms of external factors, or would you still want to probe into the cost analysis exercise for now?
No, I think that's fair. Like you're completely right with the comparison, and like it's not very different. Would love for you to go through the risk assessment and then we can take it from there.
Okay, awesome. Is it all right if I take a few seconds to structure myself?
Yeah.
Thanks. All right. So the way I'm trying to structure this is going to be risks of not paying and then the risks of paying. In terms of the risks of not paying, there is a huge risk that if we don't have any backups of the data, the data will essentially be lost. And so there might be a lot of free work involved, so that might be another piece that we might want to look at. As well, if we don't have like procuring about 200 devices in 1 or 2 days is a massive challenge because not everyone just has that lying around. So maybe we might be looking at disruptions even beyond just those 2 days. So those are a few risks of not paying. In terms of risks of paying, I'm thinking that it is completely possible that in any hostage situation you might accept the demands of the perpetrator, but then they don't release those hostages. So it is a huge risk that the company can pay the ransom and then they still don't decrypt the files or like give them away. Or another huge risk could be that they actually leak them out on the internet, and then if it's sensitive information, it might be an issue. Another risk I'm thinking of is that looking towards the future, if a company were to pay the ransom, it might in some sense encourage future ransomware attacks on either on that industry or on that company itself. So that would be another issue. Of all these, I feel like the biggest risk we might have is that the folks who have infiltrated or like placed the ransomware just simply don't hold their end of the bargain even if we pay. I think that might be the biggest risk.
Yeah, so I think those are all very fair assessments of both the risks, and it's hard to sort of come to a conclusion on the answer because it's obviously not black and white like we've been discussing so far. And I think pushing your point on the risk of actually the perpetrators not fulfilling their part of the bargain, we do have another question which would be great to get your insights on. So we've sort of come to a conclusion through some other research that about in 25% of the cases, it seems that the hostage takers actually don't decrypt our devices even when we pay. So we'd love for you to firstly incorporate that into your math and see how that sort of changes things. And at the same time, while you do that, so far we've calculated something for a company size of 500 million, which is obviously an arbitrary size that we've selected. I think what would be more helpful if you could maybe figure out the breaking point or the break-even point at which not paying becomes more costly than paying.
All right, from a company size perspective. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Makes sense. Let me just take 1 second to put these things on paper. All right. So first we want to understand how 25% of perpetrators not decrypting the devices fits into our math, right? So going back to our numbers of what are the costs of not paying, we saw that there's 200 devices, and we saw that we have to spend 40K. So 200K plus 40K, that was the original cash cost that we were looking at. And that number times 25% is essentially the cash costs of paying and not receiving the decryption key. So that would be 240K times 25%. So that's 60K. And so I would add that 60K to our number of paying, which was 360K. And so we're looking at an average cost of about 420K, which actually pushes the true cost of paying even further, which is interesting. So that might move us on the other side of maybe not paying, because hey, what's the point of paying if it's even worse? So yeah, we're looking at a $420,000 number, and then in terms of the break even, what we can do is try to understand what might be the difference between the two situations, and then that difference can be in some sense I can divide I can divide the revenue number. So sorry, let me say that again. We've got the difference. The difference will be added on top of our existing revenue number, and then we can understand what that incremental revenue number is.
Yep.
Maybe just going through the numbers might be easier. So our difference is going to be $420,000 minus 240K cash cost that we just discussed earlier. So that number is going to be 180,000. And in 2 days, if we are losing are we losing this in 1 day or 2 days? We're losing a total of 180,000. So per day, we would be losing 90,000.
Okay.
So if we are looking at 90,000 of like a daily revenue gap in some sense, I could scale this 90,000 number up to the full year. And is it still okay to go ahead with the 350 days per year assumption?
Yep, that's fair.
Cool. So if we were to scale that up, that's 90,000 times 350 days. That is, just 1 second. That is 31,500K. And so that's $31.5 million of revenue. And then we finally said that the chance of our revenue loss earlier was 5%, right? So $31.5 million divided by 5%, the 5% chance will be essentially the number that we're looking for in terms of what should be the revenue for a break-even point. So I'll just quickly do that calculation as well. 31.5 million divided by 5%. Right, so I'm looking at a $630 million revenue number for companies that should essentially be worried to, like, if you're below the $630 million number, it might be better off not paying, and then if you're above, it might be better off paying. Does that sound like a reasonable number in terms of the break-even number that we were talking about?
Yep, that makes sense.
All right, awesome. So at this point, I think we understand that $630 million, if the company is there, maybe we have like a tactical suggestion to make. But beyond this, I think we understand the financials. We also have discussed the risks. Do you think it might be a good idea to try to probe some of the other risks further?
No, I think at this point, you've done a lot of analysis, and we do have some good insights coming through from all the analysis that you've done. Would love to hear, finally, how would you summarize your findings if we were to publish the paper?
Yep. Is it okay if I just take a few seconds to structure myself?
Absolutely.
Thanks. All right. So in summary of our findings, we see that if we were to actually incorporate some of our risks into our findings, we see that the cost of not paying exceeds the cost of paying if the company has a revenue of about $630 million. In terms of deciding whether to pay or not pay, we can do a very quick assessment, or the company itself can do a very quick assessment of what is their existing tech stack and what might be the loss of revenue. Those could plug into what numbers come into paying versus not paying. And in terms of some risks of either approach, if we actually were to go ahead and pay the ransom, a huge risk is that the perpetrators just don't decrypt the files. In terms of not paying, I'm considering a few risks of obviously the massive loss of revenue, the sort of reputational damage that we might have as a company overall from like not paying. In terms of next steps, I would recommend the project manager that we can probably bring in some of the cybersecurity expertise from our company to try to vet these numbers and validate them before going ahead, and then we can look at how we should want to go ahead with market side, go to market and publish this information.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eishan. This was a fun case. Cheers.
Hey everyone, it's Kenton Kavesky here, the founder of RocketBlocks. Thank you so much for watching this mock interview video. I hope you found it informative and helpful as you are getting ready to prepare for your own interviews and hopefully landing that job offer you are excited about. We have a ton of great content on the RocketBlocks channel coming out on a weekly basis, mock interviews, mini lessons, and chats with our RocketBlocks experts. So if you haven't subscribed yet already, please do so. There is a big red button below. And if you hit that, you'll get all of our content as soon as it comes out. Thanks for watching and have a great day.